What if the very country you risked your life for treated you like a criminal just because of your skin color? Imagine being a Navy SEAL, returning home after an intense training session, only to be stopped, questioned, and threatened without cause. What happens when a racist cop realizes he's messing with the wrong man? Stay until the end to see how justice is served. Subscribe to H2 Black Thread for more powerful stories. Like, share, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over San Diego, California. The salty breeze from the Pacific drifted through the air, mixing with the scent of freshly cut grass from the neatly manicured lawns of the suburban neighborhood. Logan Carter wiped the sweat off his brow with the back of his hand as he adjusted the straps of his heavy backpack. His broad shoulders and muscular build made it clear. This was a man who had spent years pushing his body to its limits. Even in his simple black tank top and athletic joggers, he carried himself with a quiet confidence, the kind that only came from experience. Experience earned in places most people wouldn't dare to step foot in. After an intense training session at a private military training facility, Logan was eager to get home. The day's drills had been grueling. Weighted sprints, strength conditioning, combat drills, designed to keep his Navy SEAL reflexes sharp, even in retirement. His arms ached, his legs burned, and all he wanted was a long shower and some peace and quiet. His car, a black SUV, was parked just down the street. It wasn't anything flashy, but it got the job done. He had just reached for his keys when, wee-oo, a piercing siren shattered the quiet of the neighborhood. Logan instinctively turned his head toward the flashing red and blue lights now illuminating the street. His heartbeat didn't spike. He had been in far worse situations before. But the sudden stop of the police cruiser right next to him, that was unexpected. The driver's side door flung open and a stocky, middle-aged officer stepped out. His pressed uniform and rigid stance suggested he was the type who followed rules to the letter, or at least the ones that suited him. His hand hovered near his holster, a subtle yet deliberate move. "Hey, what are you doing here?" His voice was sharp, demanding, not a greeting, not a casual question. A challenge. Logan turned fully, standing his ground but keeping his expression neutral. Years of military discipline had trained him to stay calm under pressure. But this wasn't a combat zone. This was his own damn neighborhood. "I live here," Logan said simply, his deep voice even and controlled. The officer's lip curled slightly as if amused. He scanned Logan from head to toe, taking in the muscular frame, the sweat-soaked shirt, the heavy backpack, and then he scoffed. "Yeah, you live here." His tone was laced with doubt. "Haven't seen you around before." Logan exhaled slowly through his nose. He had been through this too many times before, people making assumptions, sizing him up, deciding who he was before he even spoke. "Let me see some ID," the officer added, his posture stiffening, fingers now resting just a little too comfortably on his belt, a belt that carried a firearm. The request wasn't surprising. The tone was. Logan's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. He had encountered men like this before, the kind who wore their authority like armor, mistaking it for power. The kind who didn't expect pushback. "Am I being accused of something?" Logan asked, his voice steady. The officer's eyes narrowed, and for a second, Logan could see the flicker of irritation behind them, like he wasn't used to people questioning him. "There have been reports of suspicious activity in the area," the officer replied, his words slow and deliberate. "You fit the description." Logan almost let out a bitter laugh. "Suspicious activity. Right. A black man, muscular, sweating, carrying a bag in a nice neighborhood. Classic. He knew how this worked. He could push back, demand a reason, ask for a badge number, assert his rights. But he also knew that any sudden move, any wrong word could escalate this into something much worse. So instead, Logan nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I'll get my ID." But just as he reached toward his bag, "Stop! Hands where I can see them." Logan froze, his hands suspended mid-air. A split-second decision. A wrong move here could change everything. The street, once quiet, now crackled with tension. A few curious neighbors peeked through their curtains, their silhouettes barely visible against the dimming daylight. A couple walking their dog had stopped mid-stride, the leash slack in their hands as they watched the scene unfold. For a few long, excruciating seconds, Logan didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. The officer's fingers twitched near his holster. Logan had seen this stance before, not here, but overseas. In combat zones where the wrong move could mean a bullet to the chest. He could read it as easily as he could read the terrain of a battlefield. The officer was nervous, and a nervous man with a gun was dangerous. So Logan did what he had always done in high-stress situations. He stayed calm. His voice, when he finally spoke, was level but firm. "Officer, I'm just reaching for my wallet." Silence. The officer's jaw clenched, like he wasn't sure whether to double down or let go. The grip on his belt relaxed just a fraction. The tension in the air shifted just enough. "Nice and slow," the officer muttered. Logan moved deliberately, not because he was afraid. He had faced far worse than this, but because he understood that in this moment it wasn't just about him. It was about every black man who had ever been in this position. Every person who had been profiled, stopped, questioned, doubted, and treated as a threat in their own neighborhood. He reached into his bag, pulled out his leather wallet, and flipped it open. The officer snatched it, his eyes scanning the ID. And then his expression shifted. For the first time, doubt crept in. The authority in his stance wavered just a little. "Logan Carter," he muttered under his breath, reading the name. Then his eyes trailed down to the small but unmistakable emblem on the card. His posture stiffened. United States Navy SEAL. His face paled. "You're Navy SEAL." Logan didn't move, didn't break eye contact. He saw the hesitation, the realization, the sudden uncertainty on the officer's face. That was when the first whispers began in the small crowd that had gathered. "Wait, he's a SEAL. I've seen him before, he served overseas." Even the officer could hear them. But now he had a problem, because he had just treated an American war hero like a criminal and people were watching. The air was thick with tension. For a moment, Logan just stood there, his sharp eyes locked onto the officer's face, searching for any sign of reason. But Officer Thompson's rigid posture and the way his fingers hovered near his holster told Logan all he needed to know. This wasn't about protecting the neighborhood. This was about control. Logan's jaw tightened slightly. He had seen this before. Too many times. A black man, minding his own business, suddenly forced to prove his innocence just for existing in a place someone decided he didn't belong. He let out a slow breath. "Stay calm, stay in control." "Am I being accused of something?" Logan finally asked, keeping his tone measured. Thompson's expression didn't change. He just squared his shoulders, his stance widening slightly like he was bracing for resistance. "There have been reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, his voice steady but cold. His eyes flicked over Logan's physique, his workout gear, and finally landed on the backpack slung over his shoulder. "You match the description." Logan felt his chest tighten. "Right." A tall, muscular black man carrying a bag in a wealthy neighborhood. That was all it took to be considered suspicious. He forced himself to unclench his fists. His military training had taught him control, to read a situation, assess threats, calculate responses. But right now, he wasn't on a battlefield. He wasn't facing enemy combatants. He was standing outside his own damn neighborhood, and still, somehow, he was a threat. "All right," Logan said slowly. "I'll get my ID." Moving deliberately, he reached toward his backpack, and then, "Stop! Hands up!" The officer's voice exploded through the quiet street like a gunshot. Logan froze instantly. His instincts screamed at him, years of combat training kicking in, assessing escape routes, identifying threats. But this wasn't war. This was San Diego, California, and he was staring down a man who had a gun strapped to his waist and a chip on his shoulder. His arms hung in the air, his movements locked. "Seriously," Logan muttered under his breath, his patience now running dangerously thin. Thompson took a step forward, his grip tightening on his belt. His entire posture screamed authority, but there was something else in his stance, too. Fear. Logan had seen that look before, not in trained soldiers, not in warriors, but in rookies, in men who had power but lacked control. And those were the ones who made mistakes, the kind of mistakes that got people killed. The air was deathly still for a moment, but then Logan heard it, whispers. People were watching. A few curious neighbors had emerged from their homes, cautiously stepping onto their porches. Others had stopped on the sidewalk, some holding grocery bags, some still gripping the leashes of their dogs. And then came the first voice. "That's Logan Carter." A woman's voice, hushed but urgent. Logan's ears caught it immediately. "He's a former Navy SEAL." The words cut through the tension like a knife. Officer Thompson's jaw visibly tensed, but he didn't break eye contact with Logan. He had heard it too. But the thing was, he didn't care. This wasn't about who Logan was. It was about what he was. Logan could feel the pressure mounting. If he made the wrong move, if his voice rose too high, if his body shifted just slightly the wrong way, this could spiral out of control fast. And then what? He'd end up on the news, his face plastered across headlines that twisted the truth. Navy SEAL arrested after tense standoff with police. Officer feared for his life after confrontation with large black man. Hero or threat, the debate over Logan Carter's arrest. No, not today. He locked eyes with Thompson, exhaling slowly. "Listen carefully, officer," Logan said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm reaching for my ID slowly." Thompson didn't respond. His fingers twitched near his holster. Logan stayed still, watching. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on them, feel the weight of every moment, every second, every breath. The people watching weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses, and witnesses. They could change everything. A man in the crowd, a middle-aged guy wearing a San Diego Padres cap, stepped forward slightly. His face was wrinkled with concern, and he pointed toward Logan. "Hey, that guy's a SEAL," he called out, voice firm. "I've seen him before. He served overseas." More murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some were nodding now, realizing who Logan was. Thompson's eyes shifted just for a second. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. Logan saw the flicker of hesitation cross his face. It was small, barely there, but it was enough. Enough for Logan to tilt his head slightly, watching, waiting. Thompson's grip on his belt relaxed, just a little. The tension hadn't broken, but it had cracked. The whispers grew louder. This was no longer a one-on-one confrontation. This was a public spectacle. And for the first time, Logan saw the doubt creeping into the officer's expression. He wasn't just dealing with one man anymore. He was dealing with everyone watching. And that changed the game. Logan exhaled, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't out of the woods yet. The situation was still one wrong word, one wrong move away from disaster. But for now, Logan held the advantage, because Thompson had a choice to make. Would he double down on his authority, escalate a situation that was already slipping through his fingers? Or would he realize that today wasn't the day to make a mistake that would haunt his career forever? The crowd watched. The whispers grew louder, and Logan just waited. Because sometimes in battle, the best move is to let the enemy make the next mistake. For a long moment, the world seemed to stand still. Logan Carter took a slow, measured breath, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. His mind was a battlefield of choices. He could snap. He could raise his voice, challenge the officer, let all the anger that had built up inside him over the years explode in one blistering tirade about injustice, racism, and the weight of always having to prove himself. Or he could do what he had always been trained to do, stay calm, stay in control, and let the truth speak for itself. His choice was clear. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached into his bag. Even then, even after explicitly saying what he was doing, Officer Thompson's grip on his holster twitched. Logan ignored it. He wasn't about to let some jumpy cop with a superiority complex be the reason he became another statistic. Instead, he pulled out his worn leather military ID case, flipping it open before holding it out. United States Navy SEALs. The words were bold, undeniable, unshakable. The emblem, the golden trident, the eagle, the anchor, the pistol, glinted under the streetlight. It was a symbol that commanded respect. A symbol that meant something. A symbol that shut people up real quick. Officer Thompson stared at the ID like it was a bomb that had just been activated. His face drained of color, his lips parted, but no words came out. "You're a Navy SEAL," he finally stammered, his voice betraying the first sign of doubt. Logan didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even smirk, though he wanted to. Instead, he simply folded his arms across his chest, his imposing figure now even more intimidating in the dim light of the street lamp. "That's right," he said, his voice low but sharp as steel. "I've put my life on the line to defend this country. I've fought so that you and everyone else here can live freely without fear. So that you can wake up in the morning, put on that badge, and call yourself a protector of the law." A pause, a heavy silence. "And yet," Logan continued, his voice now dipped in something dangerously close to rage, "here I am, being treated like a criminal because of my skin color." The crowd murmured, some in shock, some in agreement, and others in disgust at what was happening. Somewhere in the back, someone pulled out their phone and started recording. A few voices rose above the quiet tension. "Are you serious right now?" A woman scoffed, shaking her head at Thompson. "This guy served our country and you're treating him like some thug off the street," another man said, crossing his arms. Others weren't even speaking, just recording, watching, waiting. And Officer Thompson felt it. He felt the power shift, the eyes on him, the weight of his mistake sinking in. His fingers flexed nervously against his belt, his pride warring with the realization that he had royally screwed up. And yet, even now, even staring at undeniable proof, even hearing the murmurs of the crowd, he refused to fully back down. Because admitting he was wrong, that wasn't something men like him did easily. Logan could see it all playing out in real time, the battle happening inside Thompson's head. And truth be told, he didn't care. He had nothing to prove to this man, but he had something to prove to himself. So Logan took a single step forward, not aggressive, not threatening, but intentional. "Let me tell you something, officer," he said, voice steady. "I don't expect you to respect me. Hell, I don't even care if you do, but you will acknowledge that I have every right to be here. And you will understand that the way you handled this situation was wrong." The crowd clapped, just a few people at first, but then more. And that was the moment Thompson realized he was losing. Thompson's breath hitched for a second, his fingers twitching again, this time not near his holster but near the radio on his shoulder. For a second, Logan wondered, is he really about to call for backup? Even now, even after all this. But the senior officer in him knew better. This wasn't a battlefield, and pride didn't win wars. Logan had seen this kind of stubbornness before, in rookie soldiers who didn't know how to admit their mistakes, in higher-ups who would rather double down on bad calls than accept they were wrong, and in cops like Thompson, who would rather hold onto their authority than acknowledge they had just humiliated themselves in public. The only question was, would Thompson be the type to let this go? Or was he going to make this worse? A sharp voice cut through the air, making everyone turn their heads. What the hell is going on here? A new police cruiser had just pulled up, and stepping out, a man in his 50s with a badge that read Lieutenant M. Reynolds. His eyes swept over the situation immediately, the crowd, the body language, the tension still lingering in the air. And then his gaze landed on Logan, his brows furrowed. "Carter," Logan exhaled through his nose. "Lieutenant," he greeted stiffly. Reynolds' eyes darted from Logan's SEAL ID to Thompson, who now looked like he wanted to melt into the pavement. "You want to tell me why the hell one of our country's most decorated veterans is standing here being interrogated like a damn criminal?" Boom. Just like that, the power shifted. Thompson looked like he wanted to disappear, his lips pressed together so tightly they turned white. Logan didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He just stood there, arms crossed, waiting, because he had already won, he had made his point, and now it was Thompson's move. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Thompson still stood there, his face pale, his body tense as if he were caught between fight or flight. The crowd wasn't backing down. Phones were still recording. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, but no one was leaving. This was no longer just a routine stop. It had become something bigger. And then, the sound of another car approaching. The distinctive whoop of a police siren, brief but commanding. A second patrol car pulled up to the curb, and the second the driver's door swung open, Logan knew everything was about to change. Lieutenant Michael Reynolds had arrived. Unlike Officer Thompson, Reynolds carried himself differently. He wasn't trying to prove his authority, he was authority. There was no hand hovering near his holster, no aggressive stance, no fake bravado. Just calm, controlled presence, the kind that only came from years of experience. As soon as he stepped out, the murmurs in the crowd died down slightly. People recognized him. They knew his reputation. He had been on the force for years, one of the few officers in San Diego that many in the black community actually trusted. And when his eyes landed on Logan Carter, they narrowed with recognition. "Mr. Carter," Reynolds said, his tone respectful. Logan tilted his chin up slightly, acknowledging him. There was a brief pause, a silent exchange of understanding between the two men. Reynolds exhaled and ran a hand over his closely cropped hair before shaking his head. "I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding." His words weren't forced. They weren't hollow. He meant it. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice steady. Logan took a moment. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. He could have gone off, lashed out, demanded more than just an apology. But he wasn't interested in playing games or making a scene. He just wanted one thing for this to stop happening. So after a brief pause, he nodded. "I'm fine." Another pause. But this should never have happened in the first place. Reynolds nodded once, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then, slowly, he turned his attention to Officer Thompson. And suddenly, the rookie officer who had been so cocky just minutes ago looked like a deer caught in headlights. "You owe Mr. Carter an apology," Reynolds said, his voice sharp but controlled. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a direct order. Thompson's face flushed crimson. His jaw tensed, his hands curled into fists at his sides. He didn't want to do it. Logan could see it, the war inside him, the battle between pride and responsibility. He had spent the last several minutes trying to assert his power, and now, in front of a crowd, a senior officer, and countless phone cameras, he was being told to do something that he clearly hated the idea of. But there was no way out. Reynolds wasn't letting this go, the crowd wasn't letting this go, and Logan was just watching, waiting. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't his lesson to learn, it was Thompson's. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thompson's mouth opened. His voice was tight, barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. It was flat, it was forced, but it was said. Logan studied him, his dark eyes unwavering. Then, after a beat, he nodded once. Apology accepted, he said, and then he added something more. But next time, officer, Thompson flinched slightly, as if bracing for another verbal blow. Next time, judge a man by his character, not his skin. The crowd clapped, some nodded, others just watched, taking in the moment. And Thompson just stood there, looking like he had just been stripped of whatever authority he thought he had. Because in that moment, everyone, including him, knew that the real power had never belonged to him. Someone in the back muttered, "Damn right." Another person said, "Took him long enough." A few people in the crowd were still holding up their phones, ensuring that if this moment needed to be remembered, it would be. One of them, a young black woman in a hoodie, met Logan's gaze and nodded, a silent sign of respect. He nodded back, because this moment, it wasn't just about him. It was about all the times before this, all the times men who looked like him weren't given the chance to speak. And now, someone was listening. Lieutenant Reynolds turned back to Logan, his face more serious now. "If you'd like to file a formal complaint, I can make sure it's handled properly." Logan exhaled, his broad shoulders relaxing just a little. "No need," he said, adjusting his bag over his shoulder. "I think the lesson's already been taught." Reynolds held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded. "Understood." And just like that, the tension that had been suffocating the air for the past 20 minutes began to loosen its grip. The crowd started to disperse, the murmurs fading into the night. Thompson stayed where he was, still looking shaken, his eyes darting around as if he were trying to understand how he had lost control so quickly. But Logan didn't care. His point had been made. And now, it was time to go home. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The tension that had wrapped itself around the air like a thick fog was finally starting to lift, but the weight of what had just happened still pressed down on everyone watching. Logan Carter stood tall, his eyes locked onto Officer Thompson, the man who had tried to turn him into a suspect for simply existing in his own neighborhood. Apology accepted. The words left Logan's mouth evenly, without hesitation, but there was no warmth in them, because this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about accountability. And then, with a tone that cut through the night like a blade, Logan added, "But remember this. Next time, judge a person by their character, not by their appearance." For a brief moment, silence hung between them, and then clap. A single applause broke the tension, then another. Then more, until the entire crowd erupted into a wave of applause and murmurs of agreement. Some people nodded firmly. Others shook their heads, still disgusted by the fact that this had even happened in the first place. And some were still recording, because this moment, it wasn't going to be forgotten. Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably, the red of embarrassment creeping up his neck. Logan didn't smile. There was nothing to celebrate here, because this was never about proving himself. It was about proving a point. And judging by the way Thompson now lowered his head, his face tight with the realization of what had just happened, Logan knew. The message had been received. Logan had been in combat zones, had stared down the barrel of enemy rifles, had fought in places where one wrong step meant never coming home. But standing here, in the middle of a quiet San Diego neighborhood, surrounded by people who had just witnessed yet another example of racial profiling in America, this moment felt just as heavy. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about every other black man who had been stopped for matching a description. It was about the ones who didn't have an audience to hold the officers accountable. It was about the ones who did everything right and still didn't make it home. And the worst part, Logan knew this wouldn't be the last time something like this happened. Not to him, not to others, not in a country where some people still looked at black skin and saw a threat instead of a person. But tonight at least, one lesson had been taught. Officer Thompson's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. His face was still burning with humiliation. His shoulders slumped slightly as if the weight of public judgment was something he wasn't used to carrying. Maybe, for the first time, he felt what it was like to be on the other side of power. Maybe, for the first time, he understood how quickly things could turn when the narrative wasn't in his favor. Would he learn from this? Would he be different next time? Logan didn't know. But as Thompson shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering toward the people still filming, Logan could tell he would never forget this moment. Lieutenant Michael Reynolds stepped beside Logan, his face stoic but knowing. There was no need for words. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken. Reynolds gave Logan a small nod, one that spoke not just of respect but of understanding. Logan returned it. Then, without another glance at Thompson, without saying anything to the people still gathered around, he turned toward his car. He wasn't here to gloat. He wasn't here for a victory lap. He was just ready to go home. And so, he did. As Logan slid into the driver's seat, his hands resting on the steering wheel for a brief moment before starting the ignition, he let out a slow breath. He could still hear the distant murmurs of the crowd outside, still see the flickering glow of cell phone screens capturing every last moment of what had just happened. He knew this would probably end up online. He knew it would spark conversations, debates, arguments. And while some people would look at it and see the truth, others would defend the officer. He was just doing his job. Logan should have complied faster. Why does everything have to be about race? Logan had heard it all before. And yet, as he drove off, leaving the flashing police lights, the scattered crowd, and the tense energy behind him, he didn't feel angry. He didn't feel satisfied either. What he felt, more than anything else, was tired. Tired of having to explain. Tired of having to prove himself. Tired of the way things always seemed to play out the same way. And yet, he knew he'd do it all again if he had to. Because if there was one thing Logan Carter believed in, it was that some battles were worth fighting, no matter how exhausting they were. Back at the scene, the crowd slowly began to disperse. People went back to their homes, their conversations lingering in the air. Some still shook their heads, others exchanged knowing glances. A few watched as Thompson finally looked up, his eyes scanning the area like a man who had just realized his entire worldview had been shattered. Maybe he would change, maybe he wouldn't. But tonight at least, a lesson had been taught. And whether Thompson wanted to admit it or not, it was one he'd never forget. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't just a routine stop gone wrong. This was a reminder of how easily power can be abused. A reminder of how quickly perception can shape reality. A reminder of why voices need to be heard, why accountability matters, why standing up for yourself isn't just an option. It's a necessity. And as Logan Carter drove home that night, one thought stayed with him: the fight for respect never ends. But tonight, at least, justice had arrived.